Hello everyone, this is Joe from Scarecrow Joe Studio. Welcome back to part 2 of our paper mache pumpkin reaper. We're going to carry on and strip mache our armatures, strip mache that skull, and we'll see how far we get. But that's going to be accomplished in this segment, part 2 here, and probably start laying on some clay in this segment as well. I'll try to keep the bloopers out of this one. Please forgive the last one. I'll lay off on the bloopers and try not to use any swear words. I do like to keep it real. So let's get started. Okay, real quick, tools and materials needed for this segment are your armature that you built, of course. Plastic Halloween skull, a cheap one. Hot glue gun, hot glue sticks, paper mache paste, newspapers, sheets of newspaper, and also newspaper cut into strips, a little container of water, and depending on how far we go, you'll eventually need some paper mache clay and some various sculpting or smoothing tools to smooth your paper mache clay. All right, so that's pretty much all you're going to need for tools and materials. All right, very first thing that I'm going to start on is the skull. And that's why I have this container of water here. And I have some newspaper cut into smaller strips. I just feel it's a lot easier with something so small to use the smaller strips as opposed to these longer, thicker strips. So what I like to do to start is I take a bunch of my strips first and I just kind of soak them in water. I want to get one layer, at least one layer of strips of newspaper just soaked in water, not in the paste. And the reason that I do that first is because once this is all dried, it's going to release a lot easier by starting out with just strips of newspaper and water. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm just going to cover this whole thing all the way around, top, front, bottom, all the way around, even the back of the skull, with these newspaper strips soaked in water first. Okay, so as you can see, I have finished laying on at least one layer of just newspaper soaked in the water onto my skull. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to strip mache this with my paper mache clay. And my paper mache clay is nothing more than a mixture of flour and water to a thin pancake-like consistency. I'm going to put several layers of the newspaper strips soaked in the paste on this skull. I am not going to be concerned about the shape, the details in it at all. I'm just going to be concerned with covering this thing probably with at least maybe 6 layers of strip mache soaked in the paste to ensure that when I cut this off of here after it dries, it will be nice and solid, and it'll be a sound armature for our skull. So that's what I'm going to do right now. This does take time. It absolutely takes time and patience. You could totally, if you want to make one of these things and you just don't feel like you have the time to get it all done before Halloween, you could totally cheat by just buying a foam skull and using a foam skull instead of creating this like I'm doing from start to finish here. So that is always an option. So I'm just going to go ahead and press on and get this skull strip mached at least 6 layers. So with the newspaper soaked in just the water, It'll be a total of 7 layers, and that should be plenty strong enough to cover over with some clay, a thin layer of clay at first, and then going back in and building up the features and sculpting it out in more detail. All right, I have completed strip machining my plastic skull that I'm using as a mold for the skull for my Reaper. And I have placed it on a small plastic bucket. There are probably about, I don't know, 6 or 7 layers of strip mache on this right now. And it's a nice sunny day outside, so I'm going to go and sit this outside in the bright sunlight. And that will help aid, speed up the drying process. Now, if where you live it isn't a bright sunny day, make sure you put these things in front of a fan, and that's going to help speed up the drying process as well. If you notice, I have it propped on the inside, basically the inside of this little bucket, so that there's airflow that can get all around it. And I'll probably flip it over halfway through the day. But this should dry probably about, I don't know, in the bright sunlight, maybe 8 hours. All right, let's move on to our armature here with the base and our bust. And I have this propped up on a couple of buckets. First thing that I'm going to strip mache is the inner part, or the inside here of this cutout. Then I'm going to move on to the edges. And then lastly, I will cover over the bust. And I'm going back to my longer pieces of newspaper here for this. You know, the reason that I'm starting with the base part is because once I have this all strip mache, because I'm going to strip mache this in several layers, especially these portions here where we blocked in with the masking tape, to ensure that this is going to be very, very strong. The only thing I'm not going to strip mache is the opening of that plastic bottle. I'm just taking my newspaper strips, and if you have them long enough around this the circle here, you can actually wrap it over the side of the base, which will make it go a little bit faster. I'm just going to continue on and strip mache the inside of this circle. It's not going to need a lot of strip mache. Maybe just 1 or 2 layers should do it. Alright, so as you can see, I've got a layer of strip mache covering the inside of that hole there. And it's wrapped around the bottom. Really just need 1 layer. And now I'm going to continue, and I'm going to put 1 layer around the edges here of the base. And that's just to cover up the masking tape. I can actually cut these in half. It's just to cover up the masking tape so that when this is dry, I have a nice, more of a nice and even space there to apply the paper mache clay. So I'm going to continue on and do this all the way around. Alright, I have that layer of strip mache all the way around my edges on my base. You could probably notice that there are some areas where you could see the raw cardboard. That's not going to be a big deal. I'm not concerned about that. because I know the way that I had designed this or set this up, it's not going to collapse when I apply that thin layer of paper mache clay after this dries, because I have sandwiched that piece of foam in there. I'm going to move on now and start with the bust portion. And I do want to make sure that where the bust is attached around the base here, that I get several layers of strips on there. That will ensure that it will be held in place and strong enough and secure enough for when it dries or after it dries. It will be able to hold the wet paper mache clay. I have finished up strip macheing around the base, or where that piece of poster board that I stapled down and then put a piece of masking tape over that is going to be nice and secure on there when this dries. Next step, I'm going to go ahead and start strip macheing out this whole bust, paying particular amount of attention to these areas in here where there was a void, and we just covered those up with masking tape. Do several layers. I would say at least 4 or 5 layers, and you should be good. You will want to do the entire bust, front and back, shoulder area, at least 4 to 5 layers, so that this, when it dries, it's going to be nice and strong and solid. All right, this is completely strip mached. There's at least 4, maybe 5 layers of strip mache on my bust. And you will find that when you are strip macheing that voided area that we covered up with the masking tape, when you're applying that, it pretty much goes all the way or halfway around your bust here. So when you're doing it all the way around, it's going to have several layers on the front and the back. The only areas that'll be exposed that you have to worry about at that point is up here in these shoulder areas. And I did make sure that I got my newspaper strips right around that opening. And again, this is done. I'm going to go put this outside in the sun. Nice warm day. Again, if it's not a nice warm day where you're at, put this thing in front of a fan to help it speed up the drying process. Now, while this is drying, if you start to see that your armature is bowing in certain areas or maybe collapsing in certain areas, don't be overly concerned about it. Again, all of this is going to be covered over in paper mache clay, a thin layer over the whole thing, and then we're going to let that dry, and then we'll go in, sculpt in some details with some wet clay. You'll be able to fill in any areas that may have become uneven during your strip mache process. All right, so my skull here that I strip mached has been allowed to dry for approximately 24 hours, as well as the platform and the bust. So it's all good. It's ready to move forward. So the first thing we're going to do is address removing our paper mache skull from the plastic skull. Best way to do that, I have found, is to go straight down the middle. So I use a marker, and I'm just going to draw my line as a guide all the way down the front, the top, the back of the head or the skull and all the way down through the bottom. Once again, I'm going to say it doesn't need to be perfect. So that's my guide for cutting this off. I'm going to take my blade here and I'm going to gently cut through my my strip mached skull. I'm going to try not to cut through the plastic skull. It isn't inevitable, you know. I've cut through it before, but I have reused this skull many times without any issues. So take your time in cutting, just cutting away from the skull. Alright, so I have cut through my paper mache skull, and this might take a little effort, but I'm going to gently pull it off of the mold. There we go. That actually came off relatively easy. There we go. If you have done a good job with applying the newspaper strips with the water first and covered the entire thing with newspaper strips dipped in the water, and then proceeded on top of that to use your paste strip mache. If you did several layers, at least 6, it's not incredibly thick, but it's going to be good enough. It's a good strong armature. But that allowed it, with that newspaper strips dipped in water, allowed this thing to release a lot easier than if you had just gone ahead and strip mached it all with the paste in the newspaper strips. All right, so fire up your glue gun because we're going to glue this thing back together. So if you guys hear a lot of background racket, it's these two. They're being very rambunctious right now. This is Stella and Luna. They are mother and daughter. And these are the Scarecrow Joe Studio rats. And they're having a real good time right now. So that's where that background racket is coming from. Sorry about that. Alright, anytime that I use hot glue, I always have a little cup of cold water on hand in case I end up getting hot glue onto my fingers. I can just dip my finger into that cold water and it'll save you some pain. So that's what I suggest. My hot glue gun is fired up. I'm just going to run a line of hot glue around one of the skulls, or one of the half skulls here. And I'm going to glue them together. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. And for good measure, I'm going to run a bead of hot glue or a line of hot glue over the outside portion here where I have cut and then re-glued. One area at a time, trying to keep my hands out of that glue. I'm going to let that cool, flip it over, and run another line of hot glue on the bottom of this skull. Alright, I've got my skull cooling from the hot glue. I'm going to let that cool completely and set before I touch it again. But at this point, we're going to move forward here, and we're actually going to attach our jack-o'-lantern to this. So I'm kind of looking, and that lines up pretty good over my hole. I want to make sure that my jack-o'-lantern is straight forward on there. And I'm going to attach it primarily or first with hot glue. So I'm going to run a lot of hot glue in here. Yeah, and I don't know if you can hear that, but now I have one of our cats meowing his head off outside of the closed door. He's not allowed into the studio because of the rats. So he gets mad sometimes. Alright, so back to this. I'm going to line that up again. Line that up again. I want to make sure it's straight on, straight ahead. The opening is showing in the bottom, and it is. And I'm going to allow that to cool and set completely before I move forward. After that is cooled completely, we're going to go ahead and clay over the bottom portion of our platform here, and also around our pumpkin. We're actually going to put clay and build up some clay right around the edge underneath, because that hot glue is not a permanent. The hot glue is not what is going to permanently attach that. It's going to be the clay. So we'll get to that in just a minute. I just want to make sure that this is cool completely before I move forward. Alright, so that hot glue has set. And this is ready to go. I have my batch of paper mache clay here. I also have a container of paper mache paste. And I have a couple of paint brushes. And I use this to smooth over my paper mache clay with. A couple other things that I have here. I have some very basic things that I use for sculpting or smoothing the paper mache clay. These are just two cheap plastic sculpting tools that I got from Michael's Art and Craft Supply store, and a plastic spoon. Plastic spoons are great for smoothing over clay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take bits of my clay at a time, and I'm really going to make sure I get way down underneath there around my pumpkin, and a little bit right up above my pumpkin as well. And while I'm in here and I'm doing the back part of this, I'm going to go ahead and let me lift this up so you can see it a little bit better. I'm going to press in some of the clay around on the base that's leading up to the bust portion here. But as you can see, I'm just pressing in some clay around where the pumpkin meets the base and a little higher up onto the pumpkin itself. And I'm just going to continue that all the way around my pumpkin. Making sure I get a good amount of clay. This, when it dries and hardens, it will permanently attach this to the base. It will basically become part of the base. But I'm going to continue on and do this all the way around the pumpkin. As I continue on where the pumpkin, the back of the pumpkin there meets the bust, I'm also putting in some clay so that the back of the pumpkin is also going to be attached to the bust. I'm going to do that on both sides. Alright, I've got that clay all around my pumpkin, up a little bit, just to make sure that it's going to be permanently attached to the base and also to the bust. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paste with my paintbrush here, And I'm going to go in and just smooth it out with my paintbrush. The paste will also ensure that it is permanently attached. It will help it become permanently attached as well. So I'm going to do that all the way around. It doesn't need to be pretty because this part here, I mean, pretty much the whole base is not going to be seen because it will eventually be covered with the cloth. The base will be seen, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the base around the pumpkin here. And smoothing that out, making sure it's nice and even. That's nice and smoothed out all the way around the entire pumpkin. And around that bust area where the pumpkin connects to the bust. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on and I'm going to clay over, just adding little bits of clay. Doesn't need to be very thick, maybe like 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to apply that in sections on my entire top of my base here. I'm not really going to bother going up into this area quite yet because I do still need to attach some arms. And then after I attach the arms and strip mache them, I can go ahead and clay them over to make sure that the arms are permanently attached. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to carry on the entire top of the base here. This sculpture, you will have to do this in sections. Clay, some clay work, let it dry, go back, more clay work, let it dry. Well, not that it's not particularly time consuming. Start to finish, it's the drying time in between that is time consuming. What I like to do is I lay on the clay in little sections like that. I go back with my paste and I just smooth it out. This type of sculpture looks really cool out in like a yard display or a graveyard. You can sit it on the ground. What I do is I sit it on top of a piece of plywood because I will be claying over the bottom of this as well and sides. And sealing it, of course, after it's all done and painted. But I still sit it out on a piece of like scrap plywood or something like that, so it's not sitting directly on the ground. And then you can like kind of cover over the base with some leaves, that kind of stuff. And it looks really cool out in like a cemetery setting or a graveyard setting. Because it kind of looks like the Reaper is coming up out of the ground, sort of. And kind of just grabbing onto a pumpkin. Now I'm just using my the back or the concave portion of my plastic spoon. And just smoothing it out a little bit more. But that's what I'm going to do to the entire top surface of this platform here. 100% top of my base here is clayed over. All the way around my pumpkin, clayed over. We're going to ping pong back and forth a little bit. I'm going to sit this aside for a minute. And I'm going to go back to my skull here. Alright, so what I want to do, before I actually set it aside, I'm take my skull. Now this is not going to rest like this. I'm actually going to put a neck on him, and it'll sit, the head will sit up higher like this, because that just looks funny. So we're going to attach a neck. So because of that, on the base here of the skull, right in the bottom, that's pretty much where that's going to be. So I'm drawing in a little circle here. Now the opening that I'm drawing is larger than the opening of the bottle that's in there. The reason that I'm drawing this opening is because I'm going to eventually cut that out and attach it to the neck. But before I move on and do that, now I'm going to set this aside. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start claying over this skull. Basically the same thing, but I'm not going to clay over the inside of this circle because I'm going to cut it out. So you're going to clay over, put a thin amount of clay on the entire surface of the skull. You are not going to be sculpting in any details or anything like that, not just yet. The reason that I do this first is to ensure that once I do start sculpting, laying on more clay and sculpting the details of the Reaper skull here, I want this to be a very, very strong armature. And by putting this thin amount of clay, again, no more than 1/8 of an inch on this entire thing here, and letting it dry will ensure that I have that nice, solid skull to work with without worrying about it getting too heavy or wet and collapsing. And I'm probably not going to be able to clay over the whole thing with that eighth of an inch. But I'm gonna clay over. I'm gonna clay over the front, the sides, the top, as far down as I can get on the skull. And then I'll let that dry and concentrate on the bottom after it dries. All right, I've applied my clay to the majority of the skull, as far as I could get. And once again, with my paste, I'm going to go in and smooth, and particularly smooth out the front of the skull. I don't want it lumpy. I want to get it as smooth as I possibly can. And around the cheekbones here, get those as smooth as you possibly can. The rest of it really doesn't matter. Just the parts that are going to be showing through that cloak that we're going to eventually be creating. But because we're going to, after this dries, build up the features, his facial structure, teeth, mouth, nose cavity, all that kind of stuff, I want the front of him pretty smooth. Now, after this dries, I am going to clay over the rest of the skull, except for around that circle that I drew in the bottom where the neck is going to go. So, I won't be filming that because it's pretty redundant. So after your skull dries, carry on and clay over the rest of the skull that does not have that thin layer of clay on it yet, so that you'll be ready to go in the next tutorial to start sculpting in more of the details. We are going to sculpt in the details before we attach the skull to the neck. It's much easier to do it when it's not attached to the neck as opposed to when it is attached to the neck. So keep that in mind. All right, this is all clayed over here, except for the bottom, of course. And I went in with my paste and paint brush, smoothed it out. Then I went over it again with my back of my spoon, smoothed that over, paid particular attention to making the front, or all the areas that are going to be exposed, coming through that cloak for his head here. I made sure that that is smooth. The rest of it, not that big of a deal. I did go over it with some paste to smooth it out a bit, but as you can see, it is definitely not as smooth as the front. That's because no one's going to see it, so it doesn't really matter. It's going to be covered with that cloak. So this is going to be pretty much it for now. I do have a little bit of my paper mache clay left. A little bit left. So what I think I'm going to do is use up my clay by just applying it. Probably have enough to apply to the back. So if you do have leftover clay, go ahead and use it by starting to clay over your bust. The only thing that you do not want to clay over is these shoulder areas here. Do not clay those over because we need to have that exposed strip mache so that we can attach the arms of our bust. So go ahead and do that. Use up the rest of your clay. All right, so that's pretty much a stopping point right now for part 2. We have pretty much completed the armature. We've started some of the clay work. Do make sure that you are putting your wet paper mache in front of fans. I cannot stress that enough. I never leave wet mache just sitting in a room without any airflow. So if you don't have a bright sunny day outside, put it in front of a fan. They're going to dry a lot quicker and more solid, and it'll ensure that you won't have any problems with mold growth. So that's it. So next tutorial or next segment will be part 3. We're going to attach the arms. We're going to attach the neck. We're going to finish up some of the, do some more of the clay work, and then we're going to probably be pretty much in the home stretch. We'll work on the face of our skulls, because in the interim, after your skull has dried, you're going to go in and clay over the underneath part of it. So it'll be all nice and dry so that when we get to the next segment here coming up very soon, we can start really forming out that skull and making them look really cool. But until then, thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll catch you in the next one.